Yes, I mean that would be great if that were to happen. I would I'd still come back and I guess my interest in all of this is it possible to identify yet a deeper layer of fundamental causality, find a consensus within the communities that are still respected, the academics, whatever their flaws and weaknesses, there's still an awful lot of influence, including influence over governmental policy and so on, making a case that there's something we need to look at that isn't about policy making, but the thing that makes the policy. And if there's a problem there, that would, I suspect, presuming there was a widespread consensus, that's where the problem is, that would make our decision making very different. If, for example, and I'll say this fairly blatantly, if it was accepted that there was a species-wide neurodegenerative condition that was influencing our perception, and it affected some people more than others, we're all in the same boat together, it's nobody's fault. But the people who aspire to take control, there's a certain psychology there, it attracts a certain kind of people, have less ability to see reality, and we expect those people, through no fault of their own, to make decisions on our behalf, then we're all responsible for this situation. And if that were the case, it would become imperative to make some radical changes before we get to the symptoms, the decision-making processes, because if we don't get that right, we'll never deal with the symptoms.
That's right. And what kind of response have you had to the book so far?
So far, it's been exceptional. I'm totally aware of what I'm saying is quite challenging, although we're talking symptoms here, and we do seem to be living in one giant madhouse. So I purposely ran the basic theory past some of the sharpest minds I could reach. Bearing in mind, it's quite difficult to get stuff to people, and they're always so busy. And so far, it's been phenomenal, really, sort of some of the sharpest minds in anthropology, neurology, so on and so forth. The general view is the bits that I've taken from their disciplines fit, and they can see the sense in it. Of course, they're also aware, so, well, okay, we're kind of looking at this through blinkered vision, and that's the problem. What the hell do we then do? But at least it's a start of a consensus, and it really takes the problem back to, call it neurology, call it consciousness, call it whatever you like, but it takes it to a much more fundamental level. And we already know, you can use crude examples, whether it be mechanical damage or the traditional use of plant chemicals. You change the biochemistry and the structure a little bit, and the behavioural changes can be quite radical. And if we can figure out a way to take what may be a less than functional consciousness system that will inevitably create mayhem and change it to something that's more empathic and will not create mayhem, that's got to be worth looking at, I think.
Well, one of the things that you also talk about in the book is telepathy. You were talking about some of the sort of ancient tribes on the planet had this ability to communicate without talking and know what they were thinking, each other's were thinking. And I know that does pop up every now and again, and people do talk about that sometimes. But that is presumably again something we've lost because of our dietary change. Would you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mechanism that I'm interested in could provide a framework for explaining a lot of these very anecdotal reports, quite weak evidence or some evidence, but it's never, if it were great big spikes on oscilloscopes, it would be wheeled out and, well, here it is, we've got it. It's always quite subtle, or we got something now, we can't repeat it. If it's as simple as the structural limitations of the dominant side of our brain or the problem, then it makes an awful lot of sense. And if all the experiments were running, bearing in mind the academics would presume that we're functional, how do we work, and they like to have normal reference points. Nobody's really questioned those normal reference points. It's actually, as far as I understand, it's very bad science to presume that your only tool of investigation is functional. And that's never really been asked. So if we ask that question and change some of the parameters, we might get some radically different results. If, for example, we were to presume there might be a limit here, and we try and access the more functional side of the brain and run the same experiments, who knows?
So what kind of experiments would you run?
I suppose you'd start with the kind of traditional ideas around how to enhance states of consciousness, maybe bring them together in a controlled environment as safe as possible, bearing in mind that it's not exactly like we're living in safe times and nobody's getting harmed at the minute. I think it's worth pushing the envelope a bit and asking some different questions. So yeah, I mean, looking at the basic engineering, changing diet, approximating what our primate relatives eat, the kind of stuff I talked about before. There would be no contradiction there in the academic world. Generally, we're considered primates, so no problem there. It's not what we do at the minute. That isn't part of the normal experimental regime. Bit of a paradox, I think. Then maybe looking at some of the ideas, I've talked about sleep deprivation. It's quite a challenging idea, but it's a traditional tool. We're quite happy to prescribe antidepressants. Well, maybe we should be looking at the plant biochemistry that's part of the primate diet and replicate that and see how that affects our neural system's incredibly sensitive to chemicals. If we're now clinically deficient in chemicals, again, it's not going to work properly. And yeah, it brings up all sorts of reactions. Oh, well, chemical use, drug use is potentially dangerous. Well, yes, it is potentially dangerous. But being clinically deficient in chemicals is also dangerous.
Yeah.
So there's lots of things we can start looking at that are going on anyway, let's face it, put them in a clinical, safe surroundings and run some different experiments and see what we get.